Employee humiliates the entire Trump family in restaurant. What happened next? The fluorescent lights of Joe's diner buzzed overhead as Sarah Miller wiped down the counter for the 100th time that evening. It was already 7:30 p.m., and her feet were killing her. She wasn't supposed to work tonight. Thursday was usually her day off, time she spent helping Emily with homework and maybe watching a movie together. But bills didn't pay themselves, and Emily needed new shoes for school. "Order up!" Kenny's voice boomed from the kitchen. The old cook had been here longer than anyone, and he treated the diner like his second home. "Sarah, honey, your turkey club's ready." Sarah grabbed the plate, managing a tired smile. "Thanks, Kenny. How's that new grandbaby of yours?" "Growing like a weed." "Speaking of kids, how's little Emily doing?" Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "She got an A on her science project. Made a whole solar system out of styrofoam balls. Mike would have been so proud." Kenny's face softened. He was one of the few who knew the whole story, who'd seen Sarah cry in the break room after watching the news about the Capitol riots. "He'll see it all when he gets out, Sarah. You're doing great with her." The bell above the door chimed. Sarah quickly wiped her eyes and turned to greet the new customers. Her heart stopped. Donald Trump Jr. walked in first, followed by Eric Trump and his wife Laura. Then came Ivanka and Jared Kushner, all dressed like they'd just stepped out of a magazine. And behind them all, unmistakable even after all this time, was Donald Trump himself. "Table for 6, Don Jr. announced, barely glancing at Sarah. "Somewhere private." Sarah's hands began to shake. She thought of Mike's last letter from prison. "I believed them, baby. I believed every word they said about saving America. What kind of fool was I?" "Right this way," she managed, grabbing menus and leading them to the largest booth in the back. The other diners were already pulling out their phones, whispering and pointing. "Is this the best you have?" Ivanka asked, running a manicured finger along the vinyl seat. "It's rather quaint." "Our regular spot was overrun with protesters," Eric complained. "Can you believe it? We can't even eat in peace anymore." Sarah started pouring water, trying to steady her trembling hands. Don Jr. immediately picked up his glass and frowned. "This isn't even cold. Don't you people have ice?" "I'll get you fresh glasses with extra ice, sir." Sarah's voice sounded distant in her own ears. She thought of Emily asking just last night, "Mommy, why can't I visit Daddy? Is it because I was bad?" As she walked back to the service station, she heard Kenny whisper, "You okay, girl? I can get Marcus to take their table." Sarah shook her head. "I can handle it." But could she? 2 years of anger and grief churned in her stomach. When she returned with fresh waters, they were already deep in conversation. "The rally next month is going to be huge," Don Jr. was saying. "People are still fighting for what's right. Unlike those the 6th of January traitors who are cooperating," Eric added. "Weak people, no loyalty." Sarah nearly dropped the waters. Traitors? Mike had lost everything because he believed their lies. Their daughter had lost her father. Their savings were gone to legal fees, and she was working double shifts just to keep their heads above water. "Can I take your orders?" she asked, her voice tight. "What's good here?" Trump asked, not looking up from his menu. "Everything's so simple." "The burgers are specialty," Sarah replied. "All American beef." "All American," Trump repeated, chuckling. "Now that's what we like to hear." Unlike all these places going woke, serving that vegetarian garbage, they ordered extravagantly. Steaks, appetizers, multiple sides. Sarah wrote it all down mechanically, remembering how she and Emily now ate mac and cheese most nights to save money. As she walked away, she heard Trump's voice rise. "You know, those the 6th of January patriots, they're the real heroes. They fought for what they believed in." Sarah froze mid-step. In her pocket, she felt the weight of Mike's latest letter. He'd written about the moment he realized he'd been manipulated, watching the trial footage from his cell, about how he cried, thinking of Emily growing up without him, about how sorry he was for believing the big lie. The diner seemed to spin around her. 2 years of bottled-up pain and rage rose in her throat. She thought of Emily's tears, of their empty savings account, of Mike's face the last time they'd visited him in prison. Her hands clenched around her order pad. Part of her screamed to stay quiet, to think of the job she desperately needed. But another part, the part that had watched her family crumble while these people dined in luxury, wouldn't let her walk away. She turned back toward their table, her heart pounding in her ears. The word heroes echoed in her mind, mocking every sacrifice her family had made. Heroes? The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, barely above a whisper. But in that moment, something inside Sarah Miller, waitress, mother, wife of the 6th of January prisoner, finally broke. Kenny caught her eye from the kitchen window, shaking his head slightly in warning. He knew what that look on her face meant. He'd seen it the day the verdict came down, when Sarah had thrown her apron across the break room and sworn she'd tell the world what these people had done to families like hers. What was that? Don Jr. turned toward her, his fork halfway to his mouth. Sarah gripped her order pad tighter. 2 tables away, Mrs. Chen, one of her regulars, was watching with concern. The old woman had brought Emily Chinese New Year candy every year since Mike went away. I asked if you said heroes, Sarah repeated, louder this time. Her voice shook, but not with fear. Is that what you call them? The table fell silent. Ivanka set down her water glass carefully, while Jared reached for his phone. Trump himself looked up, his face already reddening. Young lady, he began, his tone dismissive. You don't understand what those patriots. Patriots? The word tasted bitter in her mouth. My husband's in prison because he believed you. He missed our daughter's 8th birthday. Her 9th. Probably her 10th, too. Eric Trump scoffed. Nobody made him do anything. If he broke the law, you told them to fight. Sarah's voice rose. She could feel other conversations in the diner dying out, could sense phones being pointed in her direction. You told them the election was stolen, that they had to stop the steal. My husband believed you. Sarah. Kenny's voice came from behind her. Take 5, honey. But Sarah couldn't stop. 2 years of watching Emily cry herself to sleep, of dodging bill collectors, of seeing these people continue their lives as if they hadn't destroyed thousands of families. It all came pouring out. Emily asks about her daddy every night, Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face now. She writes him letters about her school days, her friends, everything she wishes she could tell him in person. And you sit here calling him a hero while he rots in prison for believing your lies? The diner was dead silent now. Trump's face had gone from red to purple. Don Jr. was already typing furiously on his phone, probably calling someone to have her fired. Ivanka wore a practiced expression of sympathy that made Sarah's stomach turn. Miss, Jared said smoothly, I think you're overwrought. Perhaps we should speak to your manager. Sarah pulled out the folded paper from her pocket, Mike's latest letter. Her hands were steady now as she unfolded it. My husband wrote this last week. Would you like to hear what a hero has to say about believing you? Sarah's hands trembled as she held Mike's letter. The Trump family stared at her with a mixture of shock, anger, and, from Ivanka, that practiced look of false concern that made Sarah's blood boil. Put that away and get back to work, Don Jr. snapped, reaching for his phone. Or better yet, just get us another server. Sarah took a deep breath. She thought of Emily's tear-stained face when they'd last visited Mike, pressing her tiny hand against the prison visiting room glass. That memory steadied her. My husband writes, she began, her voice growing stronger. Every night I lie here thinking about what I did. About how I let them convince me the election was stolen. About how I left our baby girl without a father because I believed their lies. That's enough. Trump's voice boomed across the diner. Young lady, you're making a scene. Kenny appeared at Sarah's side. Sarah, honey. No, Kenny. Sarah's voice cracked but didn't waver. They need to hear this. They need to know what they did to families like mine. More phones were out now, recording. Eric Trump leaned back, a smirk playing at his lips. You know, this would make great content. Unhinged liberal waitress harasses former president's family. Unhinged? Sarah let out a bitter laugh. You want to know what unhinged looks like? It's watching your 8-year-old daughter make 2 Father's Day cards. One to put in the mail to prison, and one to hide under her pillow because she's afraid her daddy won't get the real one. Ivanka cleared her throat delicately. Miss Sarah, is it? I can see you're upset. Why don't we have a private conversation about this? I'm sure we could. A private conversation? Sarah's eyes flashed. Like the private conversations you had with your father while he told people like my husband to fight like hell. while he promised to march with them to the capital. Mrs. Chen had stood up from her table now. Sarah, bao bei. Think of Emily. I am thinking of Emily. Sarah's voice rose. I'm thinking of every night she asks me why her daddy believed bad men's lies. I'm thinking of how she had to switch schools because kids were bullying her about having a traitor for a father. Trump's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Someone get this woman's manager. Now. Oh, you want my manager? Sarah pulled off her name tag. Go ahead, get me fired. I'm already working 3 jobs just to keep our house. What's one more loss? Don Jr. was typing furiously on his phone. This is gold. Wait till our followers see this communist meltdown. Communist? Sarah's laugh was hollow. My husband voted for you. Twice. He donated money we couldn't afford to your campaign. He believed everything you said about the deep state, about the stolen election. He gave up everything for you. Jared Kushner tried to intervene with his practiced diplomatic tone. Ma'am, if your husband broke the law, that was his choice. Nobody forced. Nobody forced him? Sarah pulled out her phone, her hands shaking. Let me show you something. She pulled up a video, one she'd watched countless times, torturing herself with it. The 6th of January footage. Trump's voice rang out. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. Turn that off, Eric demanded. But Sarah kept playing it. These are your words, she said, her voice breaking. Words my husband believed, words that took him away from his daughter. The diner had gone completely silent, except for the video audio. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working, watching through the service window. You know what Emily said to me last week? Sarah continued, tears streaming down her face now. She said maybe if she prays hard enough, Jesus will make you tell the truth. Then they'll let her daddy come home. Ivanka stood up, smoothing her designer dress. This is ridiculous. We came here for a quiet dinner, not to be harassed by. By what? Sarah challenged. By the consequences of your actions? By the families you destroyed? Trump himself finally spoke, his voice cold. Young lady, you clearly don't understand politics. What happened that day? Don't understand politics? Sarah's voice rose again. I understand that my husband sits in a cell while you play golf and plan your next rally. I understand that my daughter cries herself to sleep while your grandchildren live in luxury. I understand that you called people like Mike patriots and heroes, right up until the moment you needed someone to blame. Don Jr. stood up, towering over her. You're done. You're finished. By tomorrow, everyone will know what kind of unhinged. Go ahead, Sarah cut him off. Show the world. Show them what happens when a working mother finally tells you the truth about what you did to her family. She pulled Mike's letter from her pocket again, hands steady now. Would you like to hear how it ends? My husband writes, tell Emily that Daddy finally understands now. Tell her, I'm sorry. I believed the lies of weak men who were too cowardly to take responsibility for their own actions. The silence in the diner was deafening. Sarah could hear her own heart pounding in her ears. Through the window, she saw more people gathering outside, phones raised, recording everything. Kenny touched her shoulder gently. Sarah. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She looked directly at Trump, her voice quiet but clear. You sit here, eating expensive steaks, talking about patriots and heroes, while families like mine are shattered. You call my husband a traitor now, but where were you when he and thousands of others were fighting for your lies? Where were you when they were being arrested? Where were you when their children were crying for them? Eric Trump laughed nervously. This is absolutely insane. Dad, we should. Insane? Sarah's voice was barely a whisper now. Insane is watching you sit here, acting like you didn't destroy thousands of lives with your lies. Insane is watching you plan your next rally, while my daughter asks Santa to bring her daddy home for Christmas. She took off her apron slowly, deliberately. You want to get me fired? Go ahead. You want to make me famous as the unhinged liberal waitresses? Do it. But remember this moment. Remember that while you're dining in luxury, there are thousands of children like my Emily going to sleep tonight without their fathers because they believed in you. The diner remained frozen in silence. Sarah could see the mix of emotions on the faces around her. Shock, sympathy, anger, fear. But for the first time in 2 years, she felt something else: relief. The truth she'd held inside for so long was finally out. Whatever came next, unemployment, harassment, viral infamy, at least she'd finally said what needed to be said. She turned to Kenny, who stood watching her with tears in his eyes. "I guess I should go clear out my locker?" But before Kenny could respond, Trump's voice cut through the silence, cold and calculated. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Sarah turned back to him, a sad smile on her face. "No, sir. The biggest mistake was when people like my husband believed you actually cared about them." With that, she walked toward the break room, leaving behind a stunned silence and dozens of recording phones. As she pushed through the kitchen door, she heard the unmistakable sound of applause starting to build in the dining room. Behind her, she could hear Don Jr.'s voice rising. "This is assault! This is harassment! We'll own this place by morning!" But Sarah didn't look back. In her pocket, Mike's letter felt lighter somehow. For the first time since he'd been arrested, she felt like maybe, just maybe, telling the truth could help heal what lies had broken. The kitchen door swung shut behind her, muffling the growing chaos in the dining room. Through the small window, she could see the Trump family in disarray. Don Jr. still filming, Eric making angry phone calls, Ivanka trying to calm their father, whose face had turned an alarming shade of purple. "Sarah." Kenny's voice made her turn. He'd followed her into the kitchen, his weathered face etched with concern. "That was either the bravest or the craziest thing I've ever seen in my 30 years here." Sarah slumped against the stainless steel prep table, the adrenaline finally draining from her body. "Probably both. They're calling the police," Marcus, the busboy, reported, peeking through the window. "And some lawyer named Cohen or Cone." Sarah nodded numbly. "I should call Emily. She's at the neighbors." Her voice cracked. "Oh God, Kenny. What did I just do? What's going to happen to us now?" Before Kenny could answer, Mrs. Chen burst through the kitchen door, her small frame vibrating with energy. "Sarah, the videos, they're already online. My grandson just called from California, he saw it on TikTok." "That fast?" Sarah felt her knees go weak. "You're trending," Marcus exclaimed, staring at his phone. "Holy shit, there's like 5 different angles already. People are calling you the truth-telling waitress." Kenny wrapped a protective arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Okay, everyone back to work. Sarah, use my office. Call Emily, call your lawyer if you've got one. This is about to get real big, real fast." Through the window, she could see police officers entering the diner. Don Jr. was gesturing wildly, pointing toward the kitchen. Ivanka was doing damage control, speaking soothingly to the other customers, most of whom were still filming. Sarah reached into her pocket, touching Mike's letter again. She thought of him sitting in his cell, probably watching the evening news in a few hours, seeing his wife confronting the very people who'd helped put him there. "Emily first," she whispered to herself. "Gotta tell Emily first, before she sees it online." As she headed toward Kenny's office, she heard Trump's voice boom through the diner. "I want her arrested. This is a disgrace. This is what's wrong with America." But for the first time in 2 years, Sarah didn't feel afraid of his threats. The truth was out there now, spreading across the internet faster than even the Trump family could control it. Whatever came next, she'd finally spoken up for her family. For Mike, for Emily, and for all the other families, broken by lies and false promises. She closed Kenny's office door, pulled out her phone, and dialed her neighbor's number. It was time to tell her daughter that tonight, finally, her mommy had stood up and told the truth, just like they'd always taught her to do. The morning after the confrontation, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone. It had been buzzing non-stop since 5 a.m. Emily was still asleep, thankfully unaware of how their world had exploded overnight. "Mom?" Sarah looked up to see her daughter in her Disney princess pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Why aren't you at work?" Sarah forced a smile. "Come here, baby. We need to talk." As Emily climbed into her lap, Sarah's phone buzzed again. Another news outlet wanting an interview. The counter showed 47 missed calls. "Remember how we always talk about telling the truth, even when it's hard?" Sarah began, running her fingers through Emily's tangled morning hair. "Like when I told you I broke the Christmas ornament instead of blaming the cat?" Sarah choked back a laugh that was half sob. "Exactly like that, honey. Well, last night at work, I had to tell some very important people the truth about what happened to Daddy. Emily's eyes widened. You mean the bad people who made Daddy go away? Before Sarah could answer, a loud knocking at the door made them both jump. Through the window, she could see news vans lining their quiet suburban street. Mrs. Miller, a voice called out. We're from Good Morning America. Just a few questions. Emily clutched her mother tighter. Mommy, why are there people outside? Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Kenny. Sarah, you need to turn on the news, he said without preamble. They're trying to spin it, but it's not working. People are sharing the full videos everywhere. She grabbed the remote with trembling hands, Emily still in her lap. The television flickered to life, and there she was, standing in Joe's diner, Mike's letter in her shaking hands, facing down the Trump family. Is that you, Mommy? Emily pointed at the screen. You look so brave. The chyron at the bottom read, Viral confrontation. Waitress challenges Trump family over the 6th of January. Don Jr. Z-edited version played first, showing only Sarah's most emotional moments, making her look unhinged. But then the anchor said, however, multiple other videos from the scene tell a different story. The full footage followed. Sarah's quiet dignity. The Trump family's dismissive attitudes, her reading of Mike's letter. The anchors were discussing the human cost of the 6th of January and a powerful moment of truth, speaking to power. Another knock at the door, more insistent this time. Sarah? It's Mrs. Chen. Sarah carried Emily to the door, checking the peephole before opening it. Mrs. Chen bustled in, carrying bags of groceries and shooing away reporters. Like vultures out there. She set the bags down. I brought breakfast. Emily, I got your favorite dumplings. As Emily ran to investigate the bags, Mrs. Chen turned to Sarah. My nephew is a lawyer, pro bono, he says. The Trumps, they already threatening lawsuit. Sarah sank into a kitchen chair. I can't afford a lawyer, Mrs. Chen. I can barely afford Emily's school supplies. Check your phone. Mrs. Chen smiled mysteriously. Not the news people, the other messages. Sarah opened her GoFundMe app. Her eyes widened. The campaign Kenny had set up last night. Support the truth-telling waitress. Had already raised over $100,000. People want to help, Mrs. Chen said softly. You spoke for many families. Sarah's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Mrs. Miller, this is Liz Cheney. I'd like to speak with you about your experience. Emily returned, mouth full of dumpling. Mommy, Jasmine at school said her daddy was like our daddy. That he believed the bad men too. Are you going to help him? Tears filled Sarah's eyes. Oh, baby. The television was still playing in the background. Now they were interviewing other the 6th of January families, showing clips of Sarah's confrontation intercut with footage from the riot. They're calling you a hero, Mrs. Chen said, squeezing Sarah's shoulder. I'm not a hero, Sarah whispered. I just told the truth. Another buzz. This time it was Mike, calling from prison. Sarah's hands shook as she answered. Baby. His voice was thick with emotion. I saw the videos. What you did. What you said. Mike, I'm sorry. I just couldn't stay quiet anymore. They were sitting there, talking about heroes and patriots, and I thought about Emily. About you. Don't apologize. Mike cut her off. You did what I should have done 2 years ago. You stood up to their lies. Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. Is that Daddy? Can I talk to him? As Sarah handed the phone to their daughter, more reporters shouted questions through the windows. Mrs. Chen muttered something in Mandarin and went to close the blinds. On television, a journalist was saying, in an age of carefully crafted political narratives, this spontaneous moment of raw truth has resonated with millions. Sarah's phone dinged with a new email. The subject line made her stomach drop. Termination of employment, Joe's Diner. But before she could open it, another email arrived. Job offer, National the 6th of January Family Support Network. Mrs. Chen returned from the windows. Sarah, more news vans coming. And she hesitated. Some men in suits. They look like lawyers. Emily was still chattering happily to Mike about her school project, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering outside. Sarah watched her daughter's animated face, remembering how just yesterday their biggest worry had been affording new school shoes. "What do we do now?" she asked Mrs. Chen softly. The older woman squeezed her hand. "Now? Now you keep telling truth. But this time, whole country listening." Through the window, Sarah could see more reporters arriving, more cameras being set up. Her phone continued to buzz with messages of support, interview requests, threats from Trump supporters, and offers of help from advocacy groups. The little house that had felt so empty since Mike went to prison was suddenly at the center of a national storm. But for the first time in 2 years, Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Emily finished her call with Mike, handing the phone back with tears in her eyes. "Daddy's proud of you, Mommy. He said you're like Wonder Woman, fighting for truth." Sarah pulled her daughter close, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. Outside, the storm was gathering strength. But inside, in this moment, she held on to what mattered most: the truth she'd spoken, the daughter she was raising to be brave, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, their story could help other families heal. A sharp knock cut through the moment. Mrs. Chen peeked through the blinds and gasped. "Trump lawyers. 3 of them." "Mrs. Miller?" a man's voice boomed. "This is your only chance to retract your statements before we proceed with legal action." Emily clutched Sarah tighter. "Mommy, are the bad men going to take you away like Daddy?" "No, baby." Sarah's voice was firm. "Nobody's taking me anywhere." Her phone buzzed again. A text from Kenny. "Major networks fighting over your exclusive. ABC offering 6 figures. Get yourself a good lawyer first." The knocking continued. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened her Twitter app. The hashtag number truth-telling waitress was trending at #1. Her inbox was flooded with messages. "My husband's also in prison because of their lies. You spoke for all of us." Finally, someone told them the truth to their faces. The suited men outside were now talking into their phones, gesturing angrily. More news vans pulled up. A reporter was doing a live stand-up in front of her house. "Sarah," Mrs. Chen said urgently, "my nephew's law firm is sending someone. 10 minutes away. Don't open door until they come." Sarah's phone rang again. This time, an unknown number. "Mrs. Miller? This is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. We need your voice at the 6th of January Family Healing Committee hearing next week." As Sarah processed this, Emily tugged her sleeve. "Mommy, look, we're on television again." The morning shows were running a split screen. Sarah's confrontation on one side, Trump's reaction on the other. He was holding an impromptu press conference outside Mar-a-Lago. "This waitress, this very disturbed woman, she's part of the radical left's attack on our movement. We're suing her, we're suing the diner, we're suing everyone." Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. They could threaten all they wanted. The truth was already out there, spreading faster than they could contain it. Her phone chimed with another email. "Book deal inquiry, Simon & Schuster." "Mrs. Miller." The lawyer's voice came through the door again. "This is your final warning." Sarah looked at Emily's worried face, then at Mrs. Chen's supportive smile. She thought of Mike, watching all this unfold from his prison cell. She thought of all the other families like hers, silenced by fear and shame. She stood up, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the door. 3 months after the diner confrontation, Sarah sat in front of the House committee on the 6th of January, adjusting the microphone with trembling hands. The massive hearing room felt overwhelming, but Emily's small wave from the gallery gave her strength. "Mrs. Miller," Representative Thompson began, "please tell us about the events that led to your viral confrontation with the Trump family." Sarah leaned forward, her voice steady. "I never planned to be here. 3 years ago, we were just a normal family. Mike, my husband, he worked construction. I waited tables. We were saving for Emily's college fund." She paused, taking a sip of water. The cameras clicked incessantly. Then the election happened. Mike started watching more news, getting angry about stolen votes. I didn't pay much attention at first. We were busy with Emily's school, with work, with life. Representative Cheney spoke next. "When did you notice changes in your husband's behavior?" Sarah clutched Mike's letter in her pocket, her trademark now, always carrying one of his letters when she spoke publicly. It was gradual. He started sending money to the Stop the Steal campaign. Our savings disappeared. When I questioned it, he'd say, "We're saving America, honey. We have to fight." The room was silent now, hanging on her every word. The morning of the 6th of January, he kissed Emily goodbye, told her, "Daddy's going to be a patriot today." That was the last time she saw him as a free man. Videos played on the massive screens, the riot, the violence, then cutting to Sarah in the diner, facing down the Trump family. The contrast was stark. "Mrs. Miller," a congressman asked, "what made you speak up that night?" Sarah's eyes found Emily in the gallery, sitting between Mrs. Chen and Kenny from the diner. They were sitting there, calling the 6th of January defendants heroes while eating $60 steaks. "Meanwhile, my daughter was wearing hand-me-downs because prison calls and commissary fees ate up our budget." And the response to your confrontation? It was overwhelming. Thousands of families reached out. Wives, children, parents of the 6th of January defendants, all saying they'd been afraid to speak up, afraid to admit they'd been deceived. Representative Raskin leaned forward. "We have reports of increased cooperation from the 6th of January defendants after your video went viral. Can you speak to that?" Sarah nodded, pulling out a stack of letters. "These are from inmates who saw the video. They write about realizing they'd been used, abandoned by the very people they fought for." One man said watching Trump's family mock their sacrifices broke the spell. In the gallery, Emily beamed with pride. Next to her, Kenny wiped his eyes. But there were also threats, Representative Thompson noted. The Trump family's lawsuit, the online harassment. "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "They tried everything to silence us. But the truth has a way of spreading." She opened one of Mike's recent letters. "My husband wrote this last week. May I read it?" At the chairman's nod, she began. "Dear Sarah, today another guy on my block came to me after seeing your testimony. He said his kids won't talk to him anymore, that he lost everything for a lie. Your courage in telling our story helped him see the truth. Maybe that's how we heal, one family at a time, one truth at a time. Love, Mike." The room was silent for a moment before Representative Cheney spoke again. "Mrs. Miller, how has your life changed since that night at the diner?" Sarah thought about the nonprofit she now ran, supporting the 6th of January families, about the healing circle she led, where children like Emily could talk about their pain, about the letters that still poured in daily. "I lost my job at the diner," she said simply, "but I found my voice. And more importantly, I found a way to help other families heal." "And your daughter? How has she processed all this?" Sarah smiled softly. "Emily wrote a school essay last week. My mom's a truth teller, she called it. She wrote that sometimes being brave means saying hard things that powerful people don't want to hear." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the gallery. "The Trump family claimed you were part of a coordinated attack," another congressman noted. "How do you respond?" Sarah actually laughed. "I was a waitress working double shifts to afford my daughter's school supplies. The only thing I coordinated was which tables got their coffee refills first." More laughter, quickly stifled. "The real coordination," she continued, her voice hardening, "was in the lies that sent people like my husband to prison, while the people who inspired them dined in luxury." As the hearing continued, Sarah's phone buzzed quietly. A text from Mike's prison. "Watching you now. So proud. Tell Emily Daddy's tears are happy ones today." Representative Thompson's voice brought her back. "Mrs. Miller, what would you say to other families still afraid to speak up?" Sarah straightened in her chair, her voice clear and strong. "I'd tell them what I tell Emily every night. The truth isn't always easy, but it's the only way forward. And no matter how powerful someone is, they can't stop the truth once it starts spreading." In the gallery, Emily was beaming. Mrs. Chen dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Kenny gave Sarah a thumbs up. "One final question," Representative Cheney said. "What do you hope comes from your testimony today?" Sarah thought of all the letters in her bag, all the families still suffering in silence. "Hope," she said simply. "Hope that other families see they're not alone. Hope that more people find the courage to admit they were deceived. And hope that maybe, by telling the truth about what happened to families like mine, we can stop it from happening to others." As she left the hearing room hours later, Emily ran to hug her. The gallery erupted in applause, but Sarah only heard her daughter's whispered words. "You did it, Mommy. You told the truth just like Wonder Woman." Sarah held her daughter tight, thinking of Mike watching from prison, of all the other families starting to speak up, of the movement for truth that had started with one moment of courage in a Queen's diner. The truth had cost her a job, brought death threats and lawsuits, but it had also started a healing that was spreading through the country, one family at a time. And that, she realized, was worth any storm she had to face. Outside the Capitol, reporters swarmed around them. "Mrs. Miller, what's your response to Donald Trump Jr.'s latest tweet calling you a crisis actor? How do you address claims that you're funded by George Soros?" Sarah held Emily close, navigating through the crowd. Mrs. Chen and Kenny formed a protective barrier around them. Her phone buzzed, another text from Mike. The whole cell block watched. 3 guys just asked to talk to their lawyers. "You're changing minds, baby." A young woman broke through the press line, tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Miller, my dad, he's in prison too. I've been so angry, so ashamed. But after seeing you speak." Sarah hugged her instinctively. "What's your name?" "Jessica. Dad's in FCI Cumberland. He believed them too." Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Like my daddy, can she come to our support group, Mom?" The healing circles had started small, just Emily and 3 other kids in Mrs. Chen's living room. Now they had chapters in 12 states. "Of course, honey." Sarah handed Jessica a card. "We meet every Thursday. All families welcome." Later that night, after Emily was asleep, Sarah sat at their kitchen table with Kenny and Mrs. Chen, watching the news coverage. "Look at Fox," Kenny pointed. "They're trying to spin it, but the comments, people aren't buying their lies anymore." Mrs. Chen nodded. "My nephew say Trump lawyers very quiet now. Hard to sue for defamation when truth is on video." Sarah's phone lit up with a new email, another prison wanting her to speak to the 6th of January inmates. Below it, a message from her publisher about the book's release date. "Did you ever think," she asked quietly, "that one moment of truth could change so much?" Kenny squeezed her hand. "Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to say what everyone else is thinking." On television, they were replaying clips from her testimony intercut with footage from the diner. The hashtag number, Families for Truth, was trending. "You know what Emily asked me tonight?" Sarah smiled through tears. She said, "Mommy, when Daddy comes home, can we help other families tell their truth too?" Mrs. Chen wiped her eyes. "That girl, she have her mother's heart." Sarah opened Mike's latest letter, reading the part that had given her strength during the testimony. "I used to think being a patriot meant fighting for a man. Now I know it means fighting for the truth, no matter how hard it is. You and Emily taught me that." The world outside was still stormy. Trump supporters still sent threats. Right-wing media still tried to discredit her. Lawyers still filed motions. But inside, in homes across America, families were finally starting to talk about the lies that had torn them apart. And in those conversations, healing was beginning to take root. Sarah looked at the family photo on her wall, taken the day before the 6th of January, all of them smiling, unaware of how their world was about to shatter. Next to it hung Emily's latest drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands with the words, "My family tells the truth," written in rainbow colors. The truth had cost them everything. But in that loss, they'd found something more valuable: the power to help others find their way back to what mattered most: family, honesty, and the courage to face hard truths together.